always dangerous to invite a professor to speak for 15 minutes. I'm used to covering a topic of Islam in 15 weeks, so we'll try to condense it to 15 minutes here. I teach at a small little university that's redundant, a small university in Southern California, Concordia University, Irvine, which is right next door to University of California in Irvine. And for the good part of 15 years or more now, I've taught a course on Islamic civilization. And it's interesting. I'm in California, so most people are distracted by beaches and Disneyland and other things. They don't take the world at home or abroad all that seriously. But for my students in the Islamic civilization class, one of the things that they find very difficult wrestling with is the political nature of Islam. Since the war on terror broke out, most of what we've fought, at least in the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, has not been Muslims generally, but particular groups of Muslims that organize themselves around some very traditional, historic ideas in Islam, all wrapped up in a package, though I think you could just simply call it the ideology of classical Islam. So I'd like to just take maybe 10 minutes to condense my 15-week course on that and run through basically just 3 points of political Islam, just to remind us, at least in terms of the Islamic enemies we fight overseas, just what it is they think about us and they think about the world. First and foremost, Islam is not just some worldview. It's not just some perspective somebody has on the world, but rather is very much a dogmatic ideology. At least traditional versions of Islam see Islam as the only real, true religion. Even Judaism and Christianity are seen as, at best, aberrations of Islam. The way Islamic theologians speak of it is they will talk about Adam being the first prophet of Allah. And ever since, through Abraham and Moses and even Jesus, Islam has continually been reasserted. And then came Muhammad, who reasserts the message of the prophets that have been corrupted over time, but inserts it in a way that now it's become universalized. It's now a message not just for the people living in the Middle East or the Near East, but rather a message that is for all people. Religions apart from Judaism and Christianity fare much worse with Islam. At least Christians and Jews, they can get second-class status under Islamic rule, but Hindus and Buddhists and all the other world religions are regarded as being guilty of shirk. And at least historically, that's my profession, is teaching history, what you see is whenever Islam dominates, non-Islamic religions, oftentimes that does include Judaism and Christianity as well, are not necessarily wiped out, but increasingly marginalized, and eventually they go missing. We saw that recently in Mosul, Iraq, with the rise of ISIS, where a relatively historic Christian population is reduced to just a handful of Christians left in Mosul. Second major component of the ideology of Islam is that political component. Shadi Hamid, who works at the more liberal leaning Brookings Institute, wrote a book not too long ago entitled Islamic Exceptionalism. He's a very liberal-minded Egyptian Muslim, and he, through all his research of organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, which is probably the most historic of the Islamist organizations, that has offshoot organizations all across the U.S. in the guise of the Council of American Islamic Relations and so-called Islamic Thinkers Society, and others, all are working towards what ISIS was able to accomplish in just a few short months, a couple of years back, all working towards establishing some sort of properly constituted Islamic governance wherever they can find a beachhead. Back at the University of Oxford, this is back in 2001, 2002, I was given a tutor, a supervisor for my PhD work, a man who I didn't know at that point, who had recently been kicked out of Belgium for translating an old fatwa from the Middle Ages back in the 90s that was used by an Algerian Islamist organization to justify the beheading of 7 Trappist monks. And as I did my course, I didn't know this side to my supervisor, but as I did my course of studies with him, one thing that was really interesting, even though he had changed his demeanor on Islam, he was no longer in favor of using violence or interpreting Islam in a militant way, the goals he had, he was just a scholar, but the goals the organizations he was a part of had Islam in the end, that Islam would come to dominate politics, wherever Islam was stationed, so to speak. And for at least Yahya Michaud, Tariq Ramadan, and some other fairly prominent European Muslims, they were looking forward to a day that not through force of arms, but simple procreation and demographic growth, Islam would come to dominate, would even use the processes of democracy to establish some sort of, it wouldn't look like Saudi Arabia necessarily, but some sort of Islamic rule in even places like Europe. Third major component of Islam, and this is the one that, at least in my view, is the one that Muslims are most concerned about, or their primary goal, and that is a change in the law. Islam is not so much concerned, or at least your traditional Muslim is not so much concerned about whether you confess the Islamic creed or not. Some Islamist organizations aren't so concerned with establishing a caliph or a caliphate quite yet. They work more gradually. But what most Islamist organizations, and what we're talking about here is not necessarily the Muslim neighbor or colleague or coworker you have. There are lots of assimilated, more liberal or progressive-minded Muslims, but those who are associated with traditional Islam, for them, what is of a primary importance is realigning the law of a nation, whether it be Egypt or somewhere in Europe or even in America, with Islamic law. You've heard of Sharia. Perhaps you've heard of this phenomenon called creeping Sharia, where Muslims who make up a very small minority of a nation, a place like America, slowly but surely, and I don't think we should be alarmed about this quite yet, but they work slowly but surely in getting small little incremental changes in the legal and cultural landscape where things align more closely to Islamic law, which in the Islamic view of things is God's law. There is a rationale to Islam. One of the big mistakes my students make, I guess it would be about 4 years ago now when the San Bernardino shootings happened, they all immediately assumed it was somebody who was mentally ill. Even when it was learned that the 2 shooters took an oath to ISIS shortly before they went on their shooting spree, the young people, and of course Californians might think this way, we're a little weird, but they still assume, as I talk to them, that it had nothing to do with Islam, but rather had to do with mental illness or hate or something like that. But what's behind things like the Benghazi attack, what's behind all those forces that we've been fighting since the beginning of the War on Terror is this totalitarian, comprehensive and dogmatic view of Islam that says, as Muhammad himself said shortly before he died, that his mission, and therefore the mission of the Islamic Ummah, the Islamic global community, was to fight the world until the world confesses that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. And it's that, as we, especially in today with all the distractions domestically speaking, which are important to, of course, stay on top of, but I think I try to remind my students that it's also important to stay on top of thinking about how we might still continue to deal with this threat that's still primarily, not exclusively, but primarily overseas, and that's the threat of political Islam, or what we might just simply call ideological Islam. Thank you.